All right, awesome. Thank you, Alyssa. And yeah, like Alyssa said, I am here to talk about aging curves in women's hockey, focusing on the NWHL. There we go. And so I want to start this with a brief sort of overview of why aging curves matter and how we can go about looking at them. And I am fortunate that I'm one of the later, I guess I'm the last presentation. And there have been multiple presentations today about whether it's things like predicting breakout seasons in NCAA women's hockey or fantasy hockey, where when you're looking at players, you're looking at their future performance and how what they've done in the past as a player informs what they're going to do in the future. And one of the big keys to that that's not necessarily captured by looking at somebody's stats year over year is how they change as they get older. Because like as you get older, you get stronger, you get bigger, and then eventually you hit an age where like that starts to go the other direction. And so being able to understand that really informs how people can evaluate players and project future performance, whether it's in terms of building the best team you can to try to win the Isabel Cup, or if you're just somebody who's playing Mike's fantasy hockey and you want to win whatever league or group you're in next year, you want to know who might take a step forward, who might take a step back, and age is an important part of that. And so the way I decided to approach this problem was using game score per game, again, developed by both Sean Ferris and Mike Murphy for NWHL. And quick overview on what game score is. It's this formula at the bottom. And the weights for each of those events, goals, primary assists, secondary assists, shots on goals, faceoffs won, loss, and penalties, comes essentially from how often they occur relative to goals. So that's why their primary assists are heavily weighted and something like shots on goals are a lot lower weighted. And so the data that I ended up using was pulled, again, directly from their hockey counts. Excellent database for NWHL stuff, as well as pulling age, and like, I guess age was the primary thing, from elite prospects for all NWHL players for the last 5 years, or for as long as the NWHL has existed, and then just basically smushing those data sets together so that I had age paired with performance in season. One of the notes before I get into sort of the evaluation and methods kind of portion of this presentation is that for 90% of this, I'm going to be talking about game score per game relative to league average. So I rescaled everything down to 0, to where 0 is average, and then 1 is 1 standard deviation above average, 2 is 2, etc. So essentially, if you're not coming from a math background, positive is good, the higher it is, the better, and 0 is average. One other note that is, I will cover that in a second. So one of the things that I like to do whenever I'm working on a project is look at what has been done in a similar sort of sense around women's hockey. And fortunately for me, there have been 2 previous women's hockey aging curve projects, one from Carly and Mike. And Carly's looked at the CWHL using offensive point share, while Mike's looked at game score for NCAA Division I women's hockey players. And what they both found was that performance really tends to peak for both of those leagues in this sort of 21 to 22, 23-ish range. And I thought that was fairly interesting, considering, again, a popular discussion today has been about how looking at and about women's hockey and women's sports aren't one-to-one comparisons to their male counterparts, but it's previous work in men's sports has sort of tended to indicate that male performance peaks sort of 25, 26, 27, maybe 28-ish. And so I thought it was awfully interesting that the two prior women's hockey aging projects indicated that it was happening earlier for women. Now, there are a couple of reasons that could be, and I will actually touch on those a little bit later. But what are some of the questions that need to be addressed when working with this NWHL data? The first one is that the league is still very young, and there aren't that many seasons of data to work with. And a lot of the players who have played seasons are very young and haven't strung together very many consecutive seasons. And so that's what this table in the bottom is indicating. Essentially, how many consecutive seasons have been played in the NWHL, as well as how many players have played that many seasons. And it's hard to string together an aging curve when most of the players in your league have only played one season, not counting if 2021 was your only season, because I'm still not entirely sure which players are coming back, which players have left for good. And so that makes it kind of tough to work on a project like this. And that's again reflected in the graph to the right, where there are very few players who have played at an age over about even like 29, 30 years old. But still, I was still interested in trying and seeing what sort of insights could be gleaned from attempting this project. So I really looked at two methods for how to visualize aging curves. One is the delta method, which essentially looks at the change in a player's performance from year to year. So when a player is 22, say their game score is exactly average. And then next year, relative to average, it's one standard deviation above. And then, so now for that player, we take the difference and put them into that age bucket from 22 to 23. And then we can do that for every player and get a result. And honestly, that's a fairly intuitive way to do it. And there's not any modeling or anything that goes into it. You just usually end up weighting by games played so that you're not overrepresenting or underrepresenting certain types of players who may or may not have been healthy or on the ice. One of the issues with the delta method is that it throws out players who only play one season and the final year of every player's career. Now, those are both really important because it's important to know which players don't get a chance to come back and play a second or third season because they intuitively didn't play well enough to warrant that return. And excluding the final year of a player's career is detrimental because, again, that was their final year where it's likely that they didn't play well enough to warrant coming back for the next season. So to approach that problem is using some regression techniques, whether it's a generalized additive model, which I will refer to as GAMS, or linear regressions. And one thing that ideally we would be able to do is include career average to that point in each season for players as an input when we look at their aging, so that we can look at how they age relative to themselves versus how they are relative to the league. Because a player going from a superstar to just a good player is probably a bigger drop in game score than a player going from average to out of the league. But that difference relative to average is different for the two of them. However, given the limited sample of players who have meaningful years strung together, it was going to be really hard to do that. So I ended up opting to go the route of looking at game score sort of relative to the league as a whole, rather than necessarily on an individual basis by including that career mean as an input. All right, so that first method, the delta method, how much does a player's performance change from year to year? So like I mentioned earlier, you have to remove players who only played 1 year and remove seasons without a following year. And and in doing that, we dropped from about 578 player seasons to just 235. And that is a massive drop, and we're losing over 50% of all the seasons in the NWHL. And so really this was not a good fit for this kind of analysis, given the difficulty in how complete the data was, just due to some of the quirks around the NWHL itself. So that led me to the question of one and done players, since those players aren't included in the delta curve analysis. And so really comparing how players who survived and came back for a second season fared as a rookie versus those players who did not return for a second year. And it was interesting that there wasn't a huge difference in games played, but there was a very stark difference in how effective the players were relative to average. And players naturally, intuitively, players who survived performed above average by using game score as a measure, whereas one and done players performed below average by about the same magnitude, but still a fairly large difference in effectiveness. And here is a quick graph looking at this difference in game score for rookie years, broken down by survivors and 1 year players, looking at it by year. And so there are some interesting trends here in that we see it trends downwards in both senses. So the older you are when you play your first season, a little bit low, you're expected to have a lower game score in your first year. That makes sense, as older players tend to be less effective for a variety of reasons. But we do see that with only a couple of exceptions, at almost all ages, one and done players are A, below average, and B, below their surviving counterparts. The couple of instances where they perform better than survivors are really at like age 21, where we have a very small number of players who played at that point, and as well as things like age 34, where there were no survivors who had their first season at 34. And so it's hard to draw huge trends and conclusions from this, other than the fact that if you don't play well in your first year in the NWHL, it's not a good sign for your longevity in that league, which makes sense when teams don't have the luxury necessarily of developing players because there's less money to go around. You need to have players who can contribute to your roster. But so taking this a step further to sort of develop the overall aging curves, I talked about the difficulties in regressing relative to the career means for players, given our limited sample. And so I really tried my two methods, linear regression and a GAM. And so using a linear regression, I just sort of threw game score relative to average as a function of age and season, naturally resulting in a straight line, which I will show you in just a minute. But for the GAM, I tried using it with a quadratic function to produce the sort of nice parabola curve that happens when you square things. That's kind of how math works. And you can do the same thing. You can use the same equation and inputs in a linear regression. However, one of the problems with that, especially on aging curve work, is that using a linear regression with a quadratic equation will result in a curve that is symmetric in both its increase and its decrease, because that's how math works, and quadratic things tend to be symmetric. However, since the GAM isn't based off of sort of that linear style, it doesn't have that problem, and which we see here. And so there are three lines on this graph, and the blue one is essentially just weighted game score per game for each year of every player in the NWHL. And we see it hold about constant as slightly above average until you get to about 27, 28, and then it starts to decrease. There is this weird little uptick at about 40. Once you get beyond 35, there are very few seasons in the data, so that's just skewed by the lack of complete data. And this curve, this yellow curve, is the linear regression. And what it's essentially, all it's really telling us is that players decrease in game score as they get older. It's not really telling us who improves or how much that decreases. So it's not super helpful, but I wanted to throw it in there just as a counter to some of the other stuff I was doing. But the most interesting curve is going to be the GAM curve in black here, where young players, about 20-year-olds, tend to perform close to average. Maybe not quite there, but certainly good enough to warrant another look. And then they get better and sort of peak around 25, 26-ish. And then after that, they start to decrease and their game score relative to average goes down, sort of as we would expect. And so really that was kind of what I expected to find based off of research in other in male sports. Though it was interesting that it doesn't entirely match up with things that have been found in NCAA hockey, as well as the CWHL from Carly and Mike. But I will touch on a couple of reasons why that may be in just a moment. But so once I had this aging curve and had looked at the relationship between how game score changes relative to age, I thought it would be fun to try and develop a projection for next year, just sort of see what came up. And the best method that I decided on for doing that projection was using Marcel projections, which is essentially a weighted average of a player's last 3 seasons regressed to both their age and league average to account for outliers. Now, Marcel projections were popularized sort of by Tom Tango in baseball and then have spread to other various sports, really due to the simplicity of them and how they still perform well. I will say this is not a very heavy modeling projection. It just sort of looks at, it's a weighted average. So the weights are down here. You weight a player's production last year by 0.6, the year before by 0.3, and then 3 years ago, 0.2. And then you just multiply that by the production and then sum it all over 1.1, which is all of those added together. It is worth noting that I did develop those weights from the CWHL data that Carly used in her aging curve presentation, mostly due to the fact that that's where I knew how to find many years of strung together women's hockey data. And we didn't, as I touched on earlier, that wasn't really an option with the NWHL data. But so then there's an aging effect for each age and how much the average increase or decrease in game score per game is for the player's next age. And then about 3 games of average production are added in. So if there was a player who only played 7 games but had a game score that was really high, they're going to get penalized more than a player who played 20 games because there's more uncertainty the fewer games a player plays. And so regressing that to average just sort of helps keep things in check from going kind of overboard on any sort of projections. And so here are just a couple of the top and bottom projections that I thought were notable. So this is the top 4 and bottom would end up being 3. And honestly, I was not particularly surprised by any of the names who are up at the top. Michaela Grant-Mentis is projected to essentially be just as good as she was last year. So would be a solid bet to repeat as MVP. Jillian Dempsey, going to remain a superstar. And then other teammates with the Boston Pride look to continue to be excellent. So they may be a favorite again to win the cup. And then on the other end of the spectrum, there's a 29-year-old, a 30-year-old, and a 38-year-old who had three of the lower end projections, which again makes sense. Again, as they are getting older, that aging curve is becoming more severe and negatively affecting their performance. So this was sort of a good sanity check, really, on my end. And I thought the results were interesting. So that's that. And so just to sort of wrap this up real quick, there are quite a few issues with this project. Again, in large part due to the fact that the data set that we were working with is flawed. And a lot of that was not something I was aware of going into this project. So I have been one of those people who has been in Carly's DMs blowing up her DMs about like, hey, I don't know why this looks really weird. What's going on? And so a lot of the things she talked about in her presentation this morning about centralization, movement between leagues, issues the NWHL had right after it was formed, and what players were being paid, player movement to other leagues, which was not something I expected to have to deal with, as well as like older players who just can't continue to play even if they're still good, because they have to do something where they can make a living wage and continue to play. And so those were a lot of problems that really affected how concrete of conclusions I could draw from this. And one thing I would be interested in the future, whoopsie daisy, to address those would be to pair player data over their entire playing career using some sort of league equivalencies, or a metric that looked at how good a player was relative to the rest of the world, if there was such a project presented earlier today, and look at how things like that change over the entire duration of a player's career. Because I think that would yield a lot of interesting insights, especially given that there are so many women's hockey leagues and players are so widespread between them. It makes doing something like this kind of hard. But all in all, I was happy with the results and the process. And so as I wrap up, I just want to give a huge thank you to Alyssa, Carly, and Mike for putting this conference together, as it was super fun to be up here talking to you guys twice, which I'm still not sure how that happened. So you can find me on Twitter, BenHowell71, and code for this project, code, the data, and a write-up will all be posted at a slightly later date, given that the code is still very messy and I do not want to post it yet. But if you are interested, keep a lookout from that. I will definitely post a link on Twitter when it's ready. But yeah, thank you. And I will go ahead and open it up to questions if there are questions in the chat.
Awesome, Ben. Thank you so much for that. I believe the chat at some point was plotting for an epic super project, which was this stuff, the
Yes.
breakout season stuff, and the
Yes.
women's hockey E stuff. They were like, what if we smush them all together?
Let's do it.
There was a full planning session I think I saw go down
Okay.
in the middle, so I'll give them a second to stop planning and actually give me questions.
Sounds good. It's exciting to hear. I would be happy to work on something like that.
Also, I made the mistake. I was like listening to you like live and then watching the delayed stream, so you'd be saying things and I'm looking at the chart and I'm like, I don't get it. It doesn't match. What's happening?
Yeah, I can see how that would be complicated.
Yeah, that like chat would start spanning like a player's name and I'm like, but he's not talking about a player right now. I'm so confused. Let's give him a second. Does anyone want to give us a question?
Yeah.
So I feel like there are, but like they just need to catch up to us in the timeline.
Yeah. And again, happy to answer questions on Twitter, even if it may take me like a day to get back.
Someone has asked, will you be posting more of the rankings or will they just be on GitHub?
I will. That's a good point. I'm planning to release those like along with like my code and my write up and everything. Just gotta actually go through it and make sure that the only players I projected were players who played a season in 2020. Because there was definitely a player in there in that bottom four who I looked up and was like, ooh, they haven't played in a couple of years. I should not include that. But
Yeah, it gets like that sometimes.
yes, yes. So long answer, short. Yes, I will post the projections at a slightly later date again through Twitter and everything. So they will be there.
Awesome. Well, we might leave you for now. If you're hanging around in chat,
Okay.
people can ask more questions there. We're
Yeah.
going to head over to me, Carly, and Mike for a little bit of a wrap up, and then you can find out all the secrets about